Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 11th of October. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm with CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, will Abbott lead Australia into Trans-Pacific Partnership corporate dictatorship or the Maritime Silk Road? Derivatives hide losses. What's Commonwealth Bank hiding? And finally, hockey copies the CEC's infrastructure idea but fails on the money question. So first, will Abbott lead Australia into a TPP corporate dictatorship or the Maritime Silk Road? Craig, we've just had the Bali APEC summit, and APEC is one of the major economic forums globally for the world, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. So this was Tony Abbott's first foray onto the international stage representing Australia, and it's quite interesting what he was confronted with, because there were two opposing agendas that collided at APEC, not in a dramatic way that the media reported or whatever, but for those who know these things, it's very stark. The first is Obama couldn't go, but John Kerry and the Americans who were present were pushing this idea of a Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it's a free trade agreement, and there's 12 countries in the Asia Pacific that are sort of negotiating partners in that free trade agreement. 12 countries excluding China. China is not participating in this. We'll talk about that in a minute. The second is China. China's input to the whole event was it has a new president, Xi Jinping, and what it was saying and promoting at APEC was quite a bit different than the whole Trans-Pacific Partnership perspective.
Radically different, Robbie, because right up front, look, the issue comes back to a very clear indication of a fight for national sovereignty.
Yep. And
it's very disconcerting when our new Prime Minister goes over there and immediately falls into lockstep to push the British idea of, basically free trade, globalisation, privatisation, and all those policies through this free trade pact that we know have destroyed our country. I mean, the Doha round of the World Trade Forum has basically collapsed. So now they're trying to pick this sort of free trade agenda up by having these regional trade pacts. But the effect is the same. Smash sovereignty. You pit one developed economy's output, like manufacturers' output, with underdeveloped countries, call it free trade. The only people that benefit here, Robbie, are the banking system, and large multinational corporations that can actually operate across all these boundaries, and they really don't give a stuff about the people inside each of these countries, whether it be Australia or these other Asian countries. They don't care about the people.
Well, let's have a look at the TPP, and one of the reasons why China so far doesn't want to participate. A lot of people are criticising it for good reason, because this TPP would kind of do to Asia, the Asia Pacific, what the EU has done to Europe.
Yeah, well, that was an interesting thing, the Maastricht thing and the whole Lisbon Agreement or treaty. I mean, that's destroyed Europe, and if you go there, basically the people don't have a sense of sovereignty. I mean, they don't even have their own currency, Robbie. We're ahead in that sense down here, that we still have the Australian dollar, but up there they don't have it, they have the euro.
And the reason why is because the rules governing corporations and banks sit above the rules that governments can make in Europe, right? And they want to do the same thing with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, what this will do, the way they're negotiating at the moment, this will strip the national governments of the countries that participate in it of their rights. And specifically, when I say their rights, the governments have rights to do one thing, Craig, which is promote the interests of their people, right? So that will this TPP will strip them of their rights to do that in the way that they, for example, would put restrictions on corporate abuses. Under the TPP, they wouldn't be allowed to do that anymore. And the power instead would go to the corporations, who would no longer be reined in. Multinational banks and corporations would be able to stop national governments from going ahead with policies such as Glass-Steagall, right? Because that would not be allowed under this kind of arrangement. They'd be able to stop it. So no, that contravenes this treaty, therefore you can't do that. So the number one thing that we've identified for 4 years now as the most important immediate way to protect people from financial gambling and the excesses and abuses of that they would be able to stop it. And under the TPP, if there's a law that the multinationals couldn't necessarily stop, that a government's able to go ahead and do anyway, the multinationals would have recourse through an international court, right, under the TPP agreement, where they could sue that government for loss of profits that they might say they've incurred because of that law.
This is a modern British East India Company, Robbie. I mean, that's what this is. Not like gunboats and travelling around selling spices.
Well, that's an excellent analogy, because think about the East India Company, right, and the Opium Wars. If you don't know about the Opium Wars, look them up. China the East India Company was dumping opium that they grew in India into China.
Yeah.
And the Chinese people were getting just totally addicted to this stuff. And the Emperor of China said, no more, you're destroying our culture and our community, and he banned it. And they said, you don't have a right. Our profits come first. And Queen Victoria backed them up and said, in the name of free trade, not in the name of our protecting our security or something, in the name of free trade, we will invade you. And there was 2 wars to do that, to make them do it. So this is very much a reprisal of that.
What made me think about it, Robbie, was this kowtowing that Abbott's had about the monarchy. He saw the visit recently by one of the young royals, and here he's sort of slurping up to him left, right and centre as a monarchist.
What do you say? If Australians aren't all monarchists today, they would all feel like monarchists.
Yeah, well, the problem is the monarchy represents this policy of free trade, as you've just indicated, through the British East India Company. So, I mean, it's not by any means a signed deal, because you are dealing with the sovereignty of nations. And I mean, we've got a new government. Yeah, it's a Tony Abbott government, but it's very embryonic in this country. I mean, you've got a new Senate coming in, which is going to have interesting people in it. You've got Barnaby Joyce, the so-called great warrior for Australia's interests. That's how he portrays himself, coming in as the agriculture minister. I mean, how all this is going to play out really depends on really how people begin to stand up and lobby and fight and literally bring their disgust of these sorts of policies to their local members.
Well, Craig, it's interesting you say that as well, because there is an alternative, and that's what the Chinese put on the table at APEC. And what they call it is the new Silk Road. And the Silk Road was the old trading route between China and Europe, from the days of Marco Polo on. And China, in recent decades, has been promoting this idea of a new Silk Road that the US economist that we associate with, Lyndon LaRouche, actually directly influenced this idea. LaRouche called it the Eurasian Land Bridge, where you build an infrastructure corridor, not just you build it around things like high-speed railway lines, gas pipelines, fibre optic cables that can connect the advanced industrial economies of Europe with the teeming population centres of Asia, right? Mm-hmm. And the Chinese government is saying, look, we are really serious about this. This is the future of the world, real physical economic development. And then the president of China, when he was in Indonesia for APEC, he actually addressed the Indonesian parliament, where he added a dimension to it and said, we also want to have a maritime Silk Road, right? And what he's talking about is the part of the world he is in, which is Indonesia, the archipelago of Indonesia, that we are also part of. Yeah. And we put out in 2002, years ago, was it 11 years ago now, our infrastructure road to recovery that we worked on with Professor Lance Endersby, the late Professor Lance Endersby. And it perfectly complements his idea of an Asian Express high-speed transportation corridor from Melbourne to Darwin, connecting into high-speed shipping, which can connect Australia to anywhere in Asia within 1 to 4 days. And this perspective is something that would give the world a real future,
a real economic motor, a driver.
Exactly. Raise people's living standards in a physical way. So confronted with that, why on earth would we go with the TPP?
Well, that's just all part of the British imperialist idea. I mean, TPP is part of the Obama pivot plan, right, of literally trying to contain China.
Yeah. This
is insanity. We put a lot of papers out about how close we came to nuclear war in the recent period. And we've also put a lot of material out into the public area about how there is an intention to try and create a war with Russia and China. And this is what you see, again, playing out behind the scenes in these sorts of forums like APEC. You see Russia and China literally putting the ideas of national sovereignty, governments sponsoring large-scale infrastructure for the development of nations, as opposed to the British idea of free trade, which is very clearly elaborated of literally only looking at the corporate interests or the interests of the British Crown through its corporate monetarist interests.
And Craig, I'd wager if you could actually poll the Australian people on this sort of information about it, not what they get in the media. If the Australian people got to choose between a perspective of real physical economic development in cooperation with other countries as a basis for peace, or the mad pursuit of free trade to give corporations more power over their lives and make more profits off their backs and cost them their jobs, and risk war in the process, I'd be pretty confident that 90% plus of the Australian people would want the...
But you'd have to break the rules of the game, Robbie. You have to break the power of the media in discussing these sorts of real policy ideas, which we haven't seen in the last election, really.
Well, we are, between Channel 31 and YouTube, Craig, we're going a long way towards breaking the power of the media.
That's right, Robbie. Well, we'll continue on there.
All right, we'll leave it at that. And when we come back, we're going to talk about derivatives. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Derivatives hide losses. So what is the Commonwealth Bank hiding? Craig, we're going to raise a subject here, and hopefully the audience will follow it. We'll try and make it as straightforward as possible. But we've been...
You're going to give gamblers' secrets away, right?
We're going to give gamblers' secrets away.
That's right.
We've been asking a question that, in the context of our banks, our big four banks, and especially the Commonwealth Bank, because as we've reported here many times in recent times, the Commonwealth Bank has made a decision to no longer disclose the extent of its derivatives gambling. It used to publish the same figure for 20 years, and in the last two annual reports it stopped publishing it, and they admitted to me they do not want it disclosed. But anyway, think about this. In 2008, or since 2008, when the whole financial system hit the skids, since that time, our banks, our big four banks in Australia, have made record profit after record profit. All of them have broken their own records, and the Commonwealth Bank has broken all records, right? And last year, between the four of them, they raised, their profit was $23 billion, which is about $1,000 for every man, woman and child in Australia. There's a couple of anomalies with those profits. First is, what's the state of the actual economy of Australia they've been making those profits in? Look around you, right? Manufacturing is just, been going through carnage. We've got this incredible cost of living crisis, right? We've got real unemployment that's much higher than the official statistics say, because it's mostly hidden in, underemployment and things like that. The Australian people are not living in a good economy, whatever the official statistics have been, rigged to say. Yet our banks are reporting these enormous profits. Something doesn't add up to my way of thinking. The second anomaly is the derivatives of our banks, because at the same time they've announced record profits, they have gone on an absolute binge on derivatives gambling. And we'll put some images on the screen. There might be an animation we can show that shows the Commonwealth Bank especially accelerating its derivatives gambling, and you can see that one.
Well, what I find really striking, Robbie, is we got a report this week that the overall holding of derivatives, that's the notional capital value of the derivatives, has gone from 21.5 trillion to 23 trillion in the space of 3 months. Now
$1.5 trillion.
It's $1.5 trillion of notional capital value of that's just the overall value of derivatives. That is a huge. That's 3 months worth, right? And how can you actually sell that much? What is going on here? And the other question is, why don't these things go down? Why are they continually rising? Well, they did go down a little bit after the GFC, but since then they've gone through the roof.
Well, you have very tiny fluctuations. We'll show a graph of that. We call it blood spreading in the water. You have tiny fluctuations, but the inexorable rise is up, 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 and at an accelerating rate, as you're saying. 1.5 trillion in 3 months is the fastest I've ever seen.
And these things do have liabilities attached to them. They're not just figures. That's the dangerous thing about them.
Well, without losing the audience, let me try and explain an example. There's a man named Frank Partnoy wrote a book in 1997 called Fiasco, Blood in the Water on Wall Street. And what he shows in that book is that derivatives fraudulently hide financial losses. And he gives an example. Back in 1995, one of the first big derivatives losses was Barings Bank. which was the Queen of England's own bank, the oldest bank in London, and they had a trader in Singapore named Nick Leeson who'd made big bets that went bad, and Barings lost $1 billion and collapsed. Now, at the same time, Japanese banks had been gambling heavily on Barings, and they lost massively. The actual collapse of Barings was the 27th of February. The end of the Japanese financial year, Craig, is the 31st of March. And what the Japanese banks were faced with is reporting huge losses for the year because of their gambling losses on Barings at the end of the financial year. They had a month to try and turn it around. So enter derivatives salesman. And he reports the head of Morgan Stanley in New York, saying there's blood in the water, boys, let's go kill somebody. And because what derivatives salesmen discovered, the more desperate a client was, the more easily you could sell them derivatives. And they structured derivatives for these Japanese banks that allowed them to hide their loss. And he uses an analogy to explain how it works. He says, imagine you've got a bucket of gold. The gold is, the whole bucket is worth $100. That's the price you put on it, right? Half of the gold is real. That's worth $90. The other half of the gold is fool's gold. It's only worth $10. Now, if you sell the half that's real, if you sell it for $90, you don't make a profit. It's worth $90, you sell it for $90, no profit. However, because it's part of a full bucket, you can use some accounting trickery and you can average the value of the two halves and say each half on average is worth 50. You record it on your books at 50 and then sell the half that's real that you've recorded at 50. You sell that for 90 and you can record a $40 profit. And you'll get away with that as long as you don't sell the other half. Because if you sell the other half, you'll only be able to sell it for 10 and you'll have to record a $40 loss and it wipes out your profit. So if you don't sell the other half, you can, and he made the point, you can take you can use derivatives like this and you can structure them so you can take assets, whether it's, and they love basing them on mortgages, right? Different types of mortgages are worth, some are really valuable, some are really dodgy. You can mix them all together, you can average them out, right? You can sell the good parts but with dodgy accounting. You can claim profits that don't exist, and you get away with it as long as you park the bad parts on your books but never sell them. And you can park them there for decades, right? Leave them to some other manager in 30 years' time to make a mistake. Now, this is fraud.
You've just proven to people, I hope, why we have to have a Glass-Steagall. Right? This is absolute robbery, it's trickery, it's thievery, it's criminal. And a Glass-Steagall is a solution whereby you say, we're not going to have this anymore. We're going to have a highly regulated commercial banking system, which is regulated, and there'll be certain rules that you can't use depositors' funds for this side, these sorts of things like buying derivatives. And then you split off the merchant banking and the investment banking and all the other parts of the financial world, and you say you can go your hardest on this stuff. You want to buy these derivatives? That's fine. What you'll find is that you'll have certain bank managers in those merchant banks that will be prepared to take the risks with their own money, not depositors' funds.
Well, not always come up with ways to gamble like that. So it's pointless trying to track them all. You just got to put up a firewall and say, okay,
this
important
part of the banking system, this commercial bank that supports the real economy, no one touches it, no one gambles with it. And look, we've had a history of that. We've had a history right through the war. Ben Chifley and Curtin controlling the private banks from their potential looting of the economy under wartime conditions through regulation. We've done this. This has all just been dismantled, so we have to go back to what we know in our history has worked before.
And all that being said, though, Craig, the authorities are, obliged that if they discover clear fraud like this, someone should go to jail.
Well, that's what the Procura Commission did in the United States under Roosevelt, and that's what needs to happen. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Now, we've raised that in the context of the Commonwealth Bank. We don't know anything about the Commonwealth Bank's derivatives. They're all off balance sheet, but we're raising it because they're the ones that have taken the decision to stop disclosing their derivatives. And in the wake of the 2008 GFC, that decision should not have been allowed. So until the Commonwealth Bank comes out and proves otherwise, we are going to be banging on this question. All right, when we come back, we're going to talk about Joe Hockey copying the CEC's policies. Welcome back to the CEC Report. And finally, Joe Hockey copies the CEC's infrastructure idea, but fails on the money question. So Craig, Joe Hockey has hurried off to New York, where, by the way, he would have been visiting Morgan Stanley, the bank we were talking about in the last episode, because they're Australia's bankers in New York, Morgan Stanley. But he's gone there with an interesting proposal. And what he's proposing is that infrastructure spending be taken out of the budget and financed separately from the annual budget.
But didn't it always used to be like that?
Well, to a degree, but certainly in a press release that we put out last week in your name, Budget Cuts Kill, Time for a National Bank, you make that specific proposal that you could take the money that's spent on infrastructure outside of the budget, right, and finance that separately so that you're freeing up the money in the budget.
Yeah, it's a capital budget. It's
That's
done
right.
specifically because you shouldn't have capital items in an operating budget.
Now, here's the problem though. Joe Hockey is only going halfway what we propose, because this is actually a press release for national banking. He fails, he's created a problem, and we're going to let him express it in his own words. So if you listen to this comment he made back in 2008.
And if there have been any lessons learned, Mr. Speaker, over the last 30 years in Australia, it is that government should not be involved in banking.
What he's saying is that he's got a rule in his head. If he sticks to that rule, what he's saying with his infrastructure idea is we'll take it off the budget, but we'll finance infrastructure by going begging from private investors to pay for it, when that is not needed at all. This press release from last week highlighted an example in Australia's own history about when we had the Commonwealth Bank in the period from 1942 to 1945. That bank at that time showed that governments don't need to go and borrow money for these things. They can create it themselves. Now, that press release reports the figures which come from the 1963 reference book called The Australian Trading Banks by H.W. Arndt, that in the 9 years before 1942, the particular power that the Commonwealth Bank had to create money, credit, had only been used to the extent of £5 million. They only created that much in 9 years, because under Menzies they didn't want to use that. It was they all wanted to borrow from the private banks. As soon as Curtin and Chifley took power in 1942, that year the Commonwealth Bank created in 1 year £59 million. The following year, 43, it created £173 million. In 1944, it created £77 million, and in 1945 it created £68 million. And that was created through the use of what's called treasury bills, and that was the basis of the funding for the war effort. All that money went directly into the productive development of the Australian economy under the necessity of war. That's what allowed them to get away with it, but it transformed us. So there is no reason that with the infrastructure needs Australia has today, the government and the Hockey government, Joe Hockey, Tony Abbott government, couldn't do that. But Craig, if he's not proposing to do that, but he's just proposing to take infrastructure spending out of the budget, it would look like what he really wants to do is fiddle the books.
Well, it's again, hand it all over to private enterprise. Look what's already happened with the disasters in various things like the Clem 7 tunnel. These things are used to speculate on, to create cash flows that people make enormous amounts of money on, and at the end of the day, it's all bailed out by taxpayers.
Yep, and that just becomes a fraud. There's no actual national development perspective involved in that. All right, we've got to cut it short, but I wanted to say, if anyone here wants to revisit anything we've covered in this, go to our website, www.cecaust.com.au. It's all there.